As the human being evolves to greater awareness, civilization restructures in response. History is the record of humankind's enlightenment and of civilization's reinvention. This is Session 12, Noogenesis, in a course titled History as an Evolution of Consciousness, and that is an aspect of a larger view, evolution of consciousness theory. In this, our final session, we bring into focus our aim to look at history in the context of humankind's evolution to greater awareness. When we look at history as it is customarily taught, we focus on a particular time or event: ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the advent of monotheism, Alexander's conquest of the known world, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. Such an approach is as it should be, in that it allows us to delve into details, personalities, and interpretations. When we step back and look at history in the context of humanity's becoming in its totality, however, the character of the historic changes. Patterns emerge, trends emerge. We see events in the past as on a road that leads to the present. We see events in the present as on a road that leads to the future. The evolution of human thought, artifacts, and activities stands out. Noogenesis. Circa 100,000 years ago, our archaic human ancestors crossed the threshold to reflection. With this most profound step forward in our ascendance, the universe stood face to face with itself. And with that first look at itself, the universe, by way of humanity, felt an overpowering need to understand itself. At its most fundamental, Noogenesis is the story of humankind's struggle to comprehend its world and its existence. This struggle takes place through the creative process. The creative process is the mechanism through which consciousness changes over time. The creative process is the instrument through which Noogenesis unfolds, the algorithm of the historic. The creative process functions through the creative cycle and the creative threshold, through trial and error, and through the building on and discarding of the old to create the new. Creativity's leading arrow thrusts forward in time. It brings that which never before existed into being. Creativity's trailing arrow reshapes earlier evolutionary forms in support of the leading edge of evolution's advance, discarding what has no place in the endgame of transformation. When it comes to creativity's trailing arrow, it is not easy to rise above ideas and ways of doing things that once may have been worthwhile, but that no longer contribute to humankind's ascent. Civilization's advance has been a battle between past and future, a struggle to build on and discard the ideas and ways of earlier periods to create the ideas and ways of periods that follow. We stagnate when we direct the power of our creativity to maintain the old, for no other reason than it is the old, for no other reason than it is the way it has always been. Stagnation is the antithesis of evolution, the dark side of the creative force. The battle to overcome stagnation produces a characteristic pattern of change, manifest in wars, politics, innovation, and a reshaping of societies. Uncertainty overwhelms, and the end of a prior social order becomes clear. Uncertainty falls away to release the energy needed to thrust humankind to a more evolved social form. Noogenesis encapsulates the cycles and thresholds, the trial and error, and the struggle to build on and discard the old to create the new. Of the creative process, the ascent of civilization is characterized by periods of darkness and turmoil that break through to periods of light and understanding. 1800 years ago, we invented paper. 1100 years ago, we harnessed water power to drive the first simple industry. 700 years ago, we began the large-scale production of gunpowder and engineered the earliest weapons that allowed us to put its power to use. 400 years ago, the old world took the new world in its grasp, and Copernicus took the sun as the center of the solar system and thus as the center of the universe. 300 years ago, Galileo founded the principles of the scientific method, and Newton put forth the laws of gravity and motion. By the time of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s, civilization poised to cross a profound threshold in its ascendance, the founding of the United States of America. By virtue of the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence, the citizen did not exist to serve the government, as it had throughout history. The government existed to allow the citizen to realize his or her dreams. Scarcely 100 years later, civilization's ascent marked another profound turn. However far back one draws the line, humanity has practiced slavery. We had fought wars to free ourselves, only to turn around and enslave our former masters. Despite calls to end slavery that date back centuries, and legal measures to outlaw the practice in the early 19th century, most nations considered slavery an accepted social form. With the American Civil War, from 1861 to 1865, and the European colonization of Africa, in part spurred by a call to end human subjugation, humanity took slavery to be wrong. As, over time, the individual became more conscious and autonomous as we evolved to a greater understanding of self and world, we were able to form stronger, more intimate social bonds. In response, society became less uniform or collective, and more nestled and interwoven, or less collective. As is the beehive with its queen, or the wolf pack with its alpha male, more collective, less evolved societies have greater control by a ruling elite. Less collective, more evolved societies have less control by a ruling elite. By the time of ancient Egypt and its godlike pharaohs, communities had united to form cities, and cities had aligned to create states. States had united to create nations, and nations had aligned to create still more complex and nestled social structures. At the height of its development, about 3,400 years ago, the Egyptian Empire, arguably the world's first multinational state, encompassed a diversely organized population distributed over some 400,000 square miles. In ancient Greece, 2,300 years ago, our ascent to greater autonomy and consciousness manifest in a decline of central authority and an acceptance of democracy, defined by Aristotle to be governance by the many or the good of the many. Classically, Greek ascendance out of the collective is illustrated by the Peloponnesian War. To a remarkable degree for cultures of the day, Athens embraced the family as central to society. At the same time, neighboring Sparta was the extreme of collectivity. Ancient Rome had its Octavians and its Neros, its Caligulas and its Constantines, and such personalities were central to the empire's rise and fall, but for the most part, Rome's citizens administered their affairs locally and regionally. What united the far-flung territories of ancient Rome into an empire was a network of roads that stretched to the furthest corners of the realm, by way of trade, travel, and communication. The consciousness of the Roman citizen embraced the known world. Over time, and with steps back punctuated by leaps forward, civilization has advanced from forms with less individual freedom and more control by a ruling elite, to forms with more individual freedom and less control by a ruling elite. The communal became less important. The family became more important. Is this trend immutable? Does the future assure a less collective, more free, and individually fulfilling way of life? Does the future assure a strengthening of the family and a strengthening of the community structure made possible by a strong family? What stagnation will humanity have to overcome to bring about such a future? In 1905, Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity. In 1913, Niels Bohr hypothesized his model of atomic structure. World War I saw the first extensive use of tanks and mechanized weaponry, the first extensive use of aircraft and submarines, and the first extensive use of mustard gas, chlorine gas, and other chemical weapons. In 1915, Einstein proposed his general theory of relativity. By 1927, quantum mechanics had achieved a high level of development. World War II saw mechanized warfare advance to a degree that dwarfed all prior achievement. For almost half a century, The Cold War held the world in the limbo of nuclear annihilation. The 20th century saw human struggle of such scope and brutality that no Roman emperor could have contemplated. As humanity lifted itself out of the rubble of the First and Second World Wars and reflected on the Cold War, however, it gazed on itself with new eyes. Never again would we see the nation as isolated in the world, as protected by oceans and mountains. Never again would we identify with the beehive collectivity of the empire. Never again would we see ourselves as subservient to the whims of a ruler, subjects of a realm. As individuals, we took ourselves to be unique, autonomous beings of value not because of our place in church or country, but for no lesser reason than our humanity. In school, or by virtue of our curiosity, we learned about ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. We learned about the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Age of Enlightenment. We learned about the First and Second World Wars, and we learned about or lived through the Cold War. By virtue of history, the human being internalizes the human ascent to greater consciousness and to a greater understanding of self and world. By virtue of history, the human being embraces its transformation. The pattern of the creative process is definitive. When uncertainty overwhelms, it collapses to release the energy needed to bring forth a higher level of social order. Does our understanding of the creative dynamic, however, allow us to control the creative dynamic, to manage the buildup and release of uncertainty? By virtue of understanding, can we bring forth the future without the war and suffering that has defined the past? With our look at Noogenesis, we complete Session 12 in our course on humankind's ascent from the standpoint of evolution of consciousness theory. The session also ends our 4 courses on the topic: evolution of consciousness, economics of fulfillment, blueprint for reconstruction, and history as an evolution of consciousness.